Hello and welcome to part one of the week one lecture for PSY 230 Personality Theory. We're going to start off where most survey courses start off, and that is defining what we mean by the concept that drives the whole course. And in this particular course, that is personality. One of the challenges of this class is overcoming our everyday use of the word personality and teaching you how to define personality in the way that psychologists do. Another part of the complication of this is that every theorist that we look at is going to do that a little bit differently and make different values-based and belief-based understandings that drive those diverse definitions. But I'm going to start you off with a framework that you can use as you think about all of the theories that we explore this semester. So first, your textbook authors, Frager and Fadiman, they define personality as individual patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting. Thinking, feeling, and acting, for most psychologists, that's like all of what being human involves, is those three components: cognition, emotion, and behavior. So personality in this case is defined in terms of individual patterns. Second, we all, and this is a part of the problem in trying to come to an agreement on how do we define this thing called personality, part of being human means we are all constantly evaluating other people and kind of assessing who they are. And when we do that, what we're essentially doing is trying to describe other people's personalities. And we do that because it's useful to us. It helps us know them. It helps us decide whether we like them or dislike them. It helps us decide whether they're a threat or a potential friend. It helps us feel like we understand other people and understand ourselves. As I just mentioned, one of the critical reasons why human beings are so interested in personality is we use our assessments of personality to make predictions about other people. As a result, thinking about personality, whether we're thinking about ourselves or other people who are around us, is really essential to everyday life. I find it very interesting, since the advent of social media and the internet, this everyday task of assessing other people's personalities and making sense of them has become harder, I think, because so many people spend a good chunk of their time kind of curating their own lives for other people's consumption on the internet, and they're watching and viewing and reading and consuming the curated lives of others. What this says to me is we're both actors and audiences. We are taking in information about other people's personalities, sometimes through the filtered lens of what they want us to see, and we're doing the same with them. Not that we never did this before the internet, we certainly do. We do it all the time. But it does really show kind of the integral role that personality plays for us on an everyday basis. As we start to explore theories, what we're going to do is partly history lesson. You will note that as we get, especially in the first 5 weeks of the semester, we're talking about theories that were created long, long before any of you were born and before I was born. And that was a really long time ago. So we're talking about people who started this work trying to make sense of human expression of personality, but also the development of personality in wildly different contexts and for different reasons. It's important that you embrace this task of thinking about personality theory with an open mind, saying all of these theories have something to contribute. All of them have points of criticism, points that we can say, that really doesn't make sense. It leaves out whole components of humanity. It belittles certain aspects of our lives, or it overemphasizes others. But all of these theories, all of these approaches have something to offer. Another way to think about personality, and this I'm kind of layering on top of your textbook's definition, we have to kind of break down what are we looking for in the way these theorists define personality. Well, all theories are going to make a proposition that there are certain aspects of human personality that are stable, that all human beings have. So that's when I say stable set of tendencies and characteristics, what I mean is all of these theorists are going to make an assumption that there are certain motivational tendencies and there are certain attributes that all human beings have from birth. It doesn't deviate, it's always there. So for example, for Carl Rogers, all human beings have an internal, inborn growth motivation and a set of inherent potentials. So he assumes that all people have those things. For B.F. Skinner, he believes all human beings, the only thing stable and reliable is the capacity for growth. You know, we're born pretty much blank and our environments supply the details, but we all have the capacity to grow. For Sigmund Freud, he believed that there were certain structural elements that all human beings have, such as an id, ego, and a superego, and the conflicts between them are a stable source of energy driving personality development and expression. So all theories are going to have a stable set of tendencies and characteristics. These tendencies and characteristics, what they do is they set up first defining commonalities, things that all human beings have in common, but they also set the groundwork. Out of those stable tendencies and characteristics are going to emerge individual differences in how people think, how they experience emotion, and how they behave. These individual differences are the things that you spend a lot of your emotional and cognitive energy doing every day. You're thinking about people's attributes, their traits, what they like, what they don't like, how they're gonna behave in various situations where you encounter them. You know from your own experiences with friends and family members, people have their own quirks and uniquenesses, and that's what makes them interesting and different from one another. So part of what personality theorists are doing is saying, what are the dimensions on which individuals differ? How are their thoughts different? How are their feelings different? How are their actions different? There is an assumption that, most personality theorists are going to give some attention to this idea. For it to be a personality trait or an attribute or a tendency, it has to have some kind of regularity across time. So, you know this, you are very different in different kinds of situations. When I'm in my professional mode with my teacher face on and my teacher voice on, I'm a very different person than I am when I'm, say, out walking my dogs. Speaking of dogs, at any moment, they could just decide to start barking. Anyway, you're different in different contexts. So personality theorists aren't looking for those responses to the moment. They're looking for attributes that are continuous over time. For example, I tend to be fairly introverted. I override that in order to do my job, to be in the classroom, to be social, to have fun with friends out and about. But really, if I'm given a choice, do I want to be at home, on my couch, hang with my dog, be with my family? I'd rather do that. You have attributes like that too, that things that really are defining of you, they have continuity over time. That continuity, just to underscore the point, there are times when I can be silly, ridiculous, and appear to other people to be very, very extroverted. Students often, if they've had me in a class in person, they often say, "No way are you introverted. you tell all these goofy stories, you do this, you do that, you talk easily, you don't appear nervous. Well, part of being in front of the classroom is performance. So I put on my teacher suit and I put on my teacher face and my teacher voice and I do my job. I'm not uncomfortable with it. But if you look at my whole life and the kinds of behaviors that I exhibit, I tend to be pretty overwhelmingly introverted. Now, a way that you can kind of orient yourself to this idea of personality theorizing is to take a step back, because while we are talking about psychology as a science, personality theory is one of those areas of psychology that involves a heavy dose of the theorist's beliefs and values. And that's why I tend to prefer the Frager and Fadiman texts, because they really do a good job of putting each theorist in a historical context. They really give you a personal backstory on each theorist or each school of thought, so that you can have a context for making sense of who these people were or are and why they were coming up with the ideas they came up with. So it's helpful if you pause at this moment and think, what do you believe is true about human beings? Some areas that are kind of common themes across theories. There were some, values-based, belief-based questions like, can you say to yourself, I believe people are basically evil and they have to learn to control their negative impulses? You can either answer that with a yeah or a no or a maybe or sometimes. Some of our theorists believe strongly that the human species, Freud for example, he believes that human beings are basically animals, and the way they live together without, being rapists and murderers is essentially they have to be tamed. They have to learn to suppress that basic evil nature to move through the world and not commit random criminal acts. If you're a person who believes people are basically good and motivated to grow and do positive things, you may have more in common with a theorist like Carl Rogers or Abraham Maslow, or with some of the religious traditions that have been embraced by Western psychology, such as Zen Buddhism. If you believe that primarily personality is shaped by events and expectations, or expectations that we form about events in our experience, so it's largely about how do we conceptualize and cognitively make sense of the world around us, and our style of doing that shapes who we are. If that's the case, then you may be have more in common with more cognitivist type theories that we'll encounter, such as George Kelly's. Finally, if you might think that personality is shaped only by learning or experience, and if that's the case, you think babies come into the world and they are a blank slate, and how do they end up being who they are? It's because of the experiences they've had as babies and children, and then later they continue to change in response to the environment that they're in. If that's the case, you would have more in common with someone like B.F. Skinner. Now, if you combine these last two, the kind of cognitivist and behavioral, you would see a theory that Albert Bandura embraces, because he embraces both of those notions, but sees the limitations in each one. So the point here is, you have values and beliefs of your own. And one of the things I'd like to challenge you to do is to, as you read these theorists, as you think about their history, their own experiences, their own kind of cultural background, and their historical moment, that you think about your beliefs and values, your historical moment, your background, your upbringing, and that you ask these 4 questions of yourself. Do you believe that people are basically evil? Do you believe people are basically good? Do you think that experiences and our expectations about experiences are primarily what shapes our personality? Do you think that personality is shaped by learning? Or do you believe all of these things in combination make us who we are? Because that will help you to kind of think through, what do these theorists have to offer us as human beings? Because at the end of the day, that's what's really important about a class like this, that you can apply what you learn to your own experience. Now, we will be looking at some contemporary approaches. I mentioned earlier that many of the theories that you're going to be exposed to are from, forgive the phrase, very dead, very white guys. Many of the foundational theories like Freud and Jung and Adler and Horney are old Western European theories that are primarily masculine and exclusively white. Karen Horney is an aberration as a female psychoanalyst, and it won't be until we get to that chapter that we have any female voices involved. There are more modern approaches that include more voices, but personality theory, if you look at the field as a whole, one of its major problems is lack of diversity. I chose the Frager and Fadiman approach because it does do something that most other introductory level texts do not do, which is include diverse voices. While Frager and Fadiman do not do a perfect job of this, they certainly include more women's voices and more non-Western approaches than other textbooks in this domain. One way that your authors talk about these contemporary approaches is they start with a broad classification system. I'm not going to spend very much time on this in our studies across the course of the semester, but it is a useful distinction to make. The first broad kind of category of theories are those that take a more nomothetic approach, where they're really trying to come up with general rules and principles for how people get to be the way they are. So how do they acquire traits? How do they grow and develop? How do they express certain things or develop certain expectations of the world? These tend to be the more, here's not a real official word, a real sciencey way of approaching personality theory. So the B.F. Skinners, the Albert Banduras, the George Kellys of the world tend to be more nomothetic in their approach. And that's in contrast to the ideographic approach, where you're looking at personality by studying individuals' lives and doing so in high detail. Some of the more clinically oriented theories, such as Freud and Jung, but also Abraham Maslow, who's a humanist, he was very invested in studying in great detail individual lives. Both of these are valid, and I would argue that good personality theories enable you to do both, to talk about broad principles that are applicable to all humans, but also to give you a framework for really digging deep into individual lives. This digging deep into individual lives, your authors spend a little bit of time talking about the pros and cons of case studies. Why it's important to lay this out, many of the early theorists were physicians. Freud, Jung, Horney, Adler, they were all physicians who were at the front end of the creation of the field of psychiatry and the field of psychoanalysis. Their approach to science was largely in terms of the clinical case study. It probably wasn't called that at the time, but what they would do is they would create case reports. They would have interesting patients. They would document their therapy work with those patients. Then they would write papers about them. So it's a very old, very relied upon approach. It's still in the medical community, you still have publications of case studies. It's often, cases that were interesting, difficult, challenging, or that offer a new perspective. Now, there are some clear drawbacks to trying to derive theory from clinical case studies. On the drawback side, clinicians, whether you're talking about a psychoanalyst or an orthopedic surgeon, you can't share every single detail of cases. If you're talking about therapy and psychoanalytic clients, what you're dealing with is people who have psychopathologies, people who are, for want of a better word, struggling. So you have people who come to an analyst because they are not well, because they're struggling, because they're depressed, because they're anxious, because they're experiencing symptoms that they can't control and won't go on. So essentially you're developing theory based on people who are not well. That may lean you in the direction, as a theorist, of perceiving more pathology than is actually out there. So for Freud, for example, most of his theory is based on his clinical work with people, with a variety of what he described as neurotic conditions or hysterical conditions. And his tendency was to view human beings with a pretty jaded impression that we're all pretty messed up. Even at our best, we're still pretty neurotic. And he described himself that way as well. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't advantages. Case studies allow you to do a longitudinal approach. They allow you to follow the same person for a long period of time and get super detailed information. It can also, you can take case studies, you can take a series of case studies and test some ideas. So this is especially useful if you're trying a technique. So for Freud, if he wanted to test word association or free association techniques, or even when he tried to use hypnosis, he was essentially testing a general theory, and he threw that out. He decided hypnosis was unreliable. Good for him. Too bad he didn't throw out a lot of other things. Anyway, it can help you to test some general ideas. Case studies can also give you the ability to provide some richness that can be a springboard to later thinking in a way that the nomothetic approach doesn't permit. So if you have this rich kind of set of observations, that gives you the opportunity to really kind of extract yourself out of that and say, what new hypotheses can I propose given what I'm seeing in the people in my care? And that concludes part 1.